Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our very first session on navigating biochar carbon removals. I'll just get our presentation pulled up on the screen. Just a few quick administrative things. I just wanted to say that this webinar is going to be recorded and that you all have access to a Q&A. So our webinar is set to be around 45 minutes. Excuse me, I'm just admitting people into the lobby. So as mentioned, our webinar is set to last for 45 minutes and we have reserved 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you are not able to have your questions answered, we have also set up a form at the very end of the webinar where you will be able to submit your questions to us and we will have a member of our team to answer them. So let's get started. Thank you again for joining. This is the very first series of BioFlux's webinar series. And today we're going to be focusing on navigating biochar carbon removal methodologies. To start, just a quick introduction into BioFlux and who we are. So at BioFlux, we're a biochar carbon removal consultancy and project development company that focus on accelerating biochar carbon removal projects at both industrial and artisanal scales. The way that we do this is by implementing tailor-made solutions that are based on the operational structures, energy needs, and specific value chains of our clients. And so we offer all-around consulting for biochar production processes, selecting the correct pyrolysis technology, how to integrate energy systems into your biochar projects, as well as finding suitable applications for your biochar, finding commercialization streams for your biochar, and finally, certifying your carbon removal. So in today's webinar, we're going to be going over the key methodologies in the biochar carbon removal space. We're then going to be providing an overview of certification costs and showing how credit issuance looks like depending on the type of methodology that you're using. At the end, we'll have a quick table that summarizes the best guide for selecting the correct methodology. And then, as I mentioned, we will be moving into our Q&A session. So first, what is the importance of biochar carbon removal methodologies and why do they exist? The main purpose of biochar carbon removal technologies is to ensure the credibility and transparency in the carbon markets. So carbon removal methodologies are set to standardize measurements of carbon removal. What this means is that it certifies a ton of carbon dioxide removal is actually a ton that in the field and in practice is being removed and certified. And so this allows certifications to essentially create carbon removal sinks that are certified, that have been monitored. And so when buyers come into the space to purchase from these carbon removal platforms, they are sure that the ton of biochar carbon removal that they're purchasing truly does represent 1 ton of permanently stored carbon dioxide. Biochar carbon removal methodologies also allow project developers to access carbon financing for their biochar projects. And these, of course, tend to be very relevant and very important revenue streams for biochar carbon projects. And finally, biochar carbon removal methodologies also ensure the promotion of environmental integrity and permanence, and also ensure that there is no environmental harms that are caused from biochar carbon removal projects. In this webinar, we're going to be going over 6 primary carbon removal methodologies: Puro.earth, Carbon Standards International, Isometric, Riverse, Verified Carbon Standards, or Verra, and Climate Action Reserve. One thing that is important to mention is that the different methodologies each have different geographic scopes. So at a global level, we see that Puro.earth, Carbon Standards International, Verra, or VCS, and Isometric are operating. In Europe, in the European space, Riverse has a more European-centric focus in their carbon removal methodologies. However, it is important to say that as of yesterday, they have announced that their very first project on the African continent was certified. So they're expanding the scope. However, the most of their past projects have been certified in the European space. And finally, Climate Action Reserve is a methodology that is really focused on North America, so the US and Canada. So first, we're going to begin with Puro.earth. Puro.earth is considered one of the world's leading biochar carbon removal registries. It was launched in 2019, and it has released biochar protocols in 2022, as well as recently now in 2025. In 2025, there's a revised biochar methodology that has been published. And this is the one that we're going to be focusing on today. So we're really going to be highlighting what this new methodology, which is currently in review, is, how it's different from the previous methodologies, and what this really means for you as a potential project developer. Puro.earth currently has 81 registered biochar projects spanning across 23 different countries, and Puro.earth certifies corks. Corks are the name that Puro.earth gives to their carbon removal certificates that represents 1 ton of CO2 that has been permanently stored. Puro.earth only issues corks on an ex post basis. So this means that only after independent verification of the CO2 removed and stored has been successfully carried out, that the credits are issued. So there's no pre-issuance of credits. As I mentioned, Puro.earth released an updated methodology, which is expected to take place and take effect in December of this year. However, as early as August of this year, operational facility audits can actually begin. This means that as of August of 2025 this year, if you would like to implement the new methodology, you're able to do so. The key changes of the Puro methodology have been that they have updated their biomass sourcing criteria. There are new emission categories that need to be accounted for as part of the LCA. There are new detailed biochar production guidelines. These relate to the operational efficiencies of the project and the operation of the pyrolysis installation itself. And there's also been an update to the carbon storage monitoring, specifically on how long these periods need to be monitored for. And a new exciting highlight is that this new methodology now covers mobile pyrolysis projects. So if you're looking into having mobile installations, in the past you were not able to certify under Puro.earth, but now you're able to do so. And there are also capacity expansion audits for facilities. This means that if you would like to expand the size of your project, you're also able to do this under the new methodology. So to go over some of the main differences now in greater detail, one of the main differences is that now Puro.earth has extended their carbon storage duration to 200 years. Now the minimum amount of time that your biochar needs to show permanence in the soil as a sink is a minimum of 200 years. This is determined by the hydrogen over content ratio. And as a more robust scientific model, Puro.earth has now also introduced reflectance testing for project developers that would like to show upwards of 500-year durability. And so random reflectance is a scientific protocol that is used, and it's essentially shining white light into the biochar and getting a reflection, a random reflectance of biochar across essentially a sphere that is able to show what percentage of the biochar is inertianite. And so this allows for a more robust and more trustworthy duration determinant for the biochar. And so if you would like to certify your project on a 500+ year durability, you would have to do so through random reflectance. There are also new end uses for biochar. So the list of biochar end uses has been increased, which allows biochar project developers a lot more clarity as to where your biochar can go as a certified end use. And there's also been new guidelines on Article 6 compliance. So for those that don't know, Article 6, and specifically Article 6.4, stems out and was born from the Paris Agreement, and it allows countries themselves to generate and trade carbon credits in order to meet their nationally determined contributions. This is something that could pose a risk of double counting for certain biochar projects, and so now Puro.earth has set out guidelines in order to make sure that projects are compliant with Article 6. Some important considerations given the new methodology for project developers are that the LCA and monitoring guidelines have gotten stricter. So now there are more detailed SEAs, the decay thresholds, the baselines, and the leakage emissions all have new calculations. And you must be using now the updated decay values on a 200-year storage period rather than previously where it was based on a 100-year storage period. What this means in terms of certification and audit costs are that there's going to be a lot more effort that goes into the MRV and audit costs. However, you will also have a higher credibility of the carbon credit. There's also going to be the option for extra audits, as I mentioned, for capacity expansion, which is really interesting for project developers that are looking to scale up and increase the size of their existing projects. Previously, Puro.earth made use of the EBC positive feedstock list to set out eligible feedstocks. However, now they have developed their own list, and so there has been an update now on biomass sourcing, which must meet Puro.earth's new sourcing criteria. As I mentioned, now there's also additional reporting that needs to go in to make sure that the credits are covered by Article 6 and that there are no risks for double accounting. And finally, the operation and end uses. There are new guidelines for technology compliance rules, as well as an expanded list of end-use applications. And it's important to mention that Puro.earth allows for both soil and non-soil applications. So this includes applications not only in composting, for example, but also in construction materials. Some key considerations to make for the Puro.earth methodology is that it operates in crediting periods of 5 years, which are renewable twice. So essentially, projects crediting periods refer to periods through which you can actively be generating carbon removal certificates. And so the first crediting period for Puro.earth is 5 years. And as I mentioned, this is renewable twice. And in order to be able to generate the carbon removal credits, there's an annual output report that is required. Corks can only be issued once verified output audits have been performed and also successfully passed. And Puro.earth operates on an annual cork issuance, meaning that credits are issued after yearly reports have been passed. However, now they're going to be shifting also to an ongoing cork issuance. This is going to be coming up in the next couple of months, where monthly issuance, for example, can be passed. And so this is something that's really interesting for project developers and is a big determinant, because project developers under certain methodologies might be limited, in terms of when they're able to issue. However, we see that more and more methodologies are moving towards ongoing cork issuance on a monthly basis, rather than only being able to issue corks on one time a year, so on an annual basis. In terms of certification timeline, Puro.earth estimates between 6 to 12 months from when the project is launched and you're starting to submit the documentation. And the different methodologies offer similar approaches. All certification begins with the submission of a PDD that then must be validated. A lot of documentation needs to be gathered together, which then goes into audit preparation. Once audits have been passed and validated, then the information from the project can be sent for cork issuance. Next, we're going to go into Carbon Standards International. So Carbon Standards International is a standard that was founded in 2021. It works very closely with the Ithaca Institute as its scientific board, and it has recently received conditional endorsement by 𝐸CHROA. Important to mention that previously Puro.earth that I mentioned has already received 𝐸CHROA endorsement, and so 𝐸CHROA is essentially let's say a stamp of approval across the industry that meets certain carbon removal criteria for carbon removal certificates and methodologies. Now, Carbon Standards International not only has a carbon sink program, but they also have a quality standard. The two quality standards that Carbon Standards International operates under are the EBC, the European Biochar Certificate, and the WBC, the World Biochar Certificate. So as the name states, EBC, European Biochar Certificate, focuses on qualifying the quality, of biochar under European standards, versus the WBC, which is on a world basis, has more lenient thresholds. These thresholds are related to aspects such as heavy metal content, PAHs, as well as the chemical and physical qualities of the biochar. So, as I mentioned, there's the quality standards, and there are also the carbon removal programs. There are multiple carbon removal programs. In this webinar, we're going to be focused on the global biochar C-Sink. However, there is also the global artisan C-Sink for biochar. The Global Artisan 𝐸-𝐸 is focused on decentralized projects in lower middle income countries, typically with smallholder farmers, and these allow for production capacities of between 100 to 1,500 meters cubed per year. And there are currently over 117 projects that have gone through Artisan 𝐸-𝐸 methodology. As I mentioned in this webinar, we're going to be focused on the global 𝐸-𝐸. So this is focused on industrial biochar projects. Currently, the registry lists 81 projects that have undergone this certification. A very important point is that in order to be able to go through the global biochar 𝐸-𝐸 methodology, you first need to pass through the quality standards, so the EBC or the WBC. You cannot register your carbon sinks unless you have already gotten your quality standard through the EBC or the WBC. So you must be EBC and WBC quality certified before being able to generate your carbon credits through the 𝐸-𝐸 methodology. Some of the key requirements for the global 𝐸-𝐸 methodology, as I mentioned, are that your projects must be certified under EBC or WBC quality standards. The biochar must meet and be produced from a positive feedstock list that CSI sets out, and the application determines the permanence in the case of Carbon Standards International. So typically when you test your biochar and you find that there's a hydrogen over carbon content of less than 0.4, here you're eligible to generate zinc 1000s, which show 1000-year permanence. However, if the hydrogen over carbon ratio is greater than 0.4, then your biochar carbon sink is considered a temporary carbon sink. And typically these have lifespans of 20 years. The end uses of biochar under Carbon Standards International are also for soil and non-soil materials. So if you would like to use your biochar in construction materials, for example, this is allowed under Carbon Standards International. Something that's important to highlight about Carbon Standards International is in terms of the tracking and verification, CSI works with a biochar tool, and this accounts for all emissions and activities from the factory to the gate. So this is considering everything that's the biochar production, emissions from the pyrolysis process, the packaging of the biochar, until it is about to leave the factory gate. All other emissions that come from the transportation of the biochar to its end use, the application of the biochar itself, these I call gate to end use emissions, those need to be measured and determined by a certified DMRV partner. And on the website of Carbon Standards International, you're able to see the DMRV partners that they have endorsed. So unlike other methodologies that have essentially cradle to grave tracking in the LCA, Carbon Standards International works on a cradle to gate, and then a DMRV provider goes through and tracks all of the emissions from gate to the final end use. All of that information, together from the biochar tool and the DMRV provider, is then sent to the Carbon 𝐸-𝐸 tool, where the information is centralized, and there the official carbon sink credit can be generated. And then there are official traders that can transfer and retire credits on behalf of their clients. And so this is also something that's observable on CSI's website, is that you can see the list of different traders that are endorsed and are able to trade and retire credits on behalf of their clients. The crediting periods of Carbon Standards International are on a continuous issuance basis as soon as biochar application has been verified and tracked. So Carbon Standards International is one of the most flexible in its crediting periods. Some other methodologies, as I mentioned, might operate on monthly, quarterly, or annual basis. Carbon Standards International does not have a set point. It is up to the project developer to decide when they want to validate production batches. However, it's important to keep in mind that you want to be cost effective here and ensure that you have enough biochar that has been sunk to create sinks that are going to be financially interesting from a financial perspective, because there are, of course, verification costs that are linked to these. And it's also important to note that Carbon Standards International does not have a minimum project size, but similar to the issuance frequency, you want to make sure that the project that you're operating is large enough to be able to produce a financially viable project. In terms of the certification timeline, it's about 6 months. Of course, all of these certification timelines are very much dependent on the backlog that the certification bodies may have, but typically you can get your EBC, WBC certification, your quality certification between 1 to 3 months, then moving to technical pre-audits that can happen on a monthly basis, so around 1 month, and then moving to on-site reviews, corrections and corrective actions, which can take 2 months or more. These are all, of course, dependent on the documentation that the project developers are sharing. It's also dependent on the amount of corrective actions that might be required for projects. But typically, if everything is going smoothly, you are able to get your project certified in about 6 months, which is a very quick timeline. Next, we're going to be moving towards Isometric. Isometric has just recently been launched last year in July of 2024, and they really position themselves as a methodology that has a goal to address issues with credibility on the voluntary carbon market through durable and permanent CDR. And so their approach is to be science-based, transparent, and supplier funding. We'll talk about supplier funding, but what this means essentially is that if you go through Isometric's protocol, as a project developer, you do not incur any cost for certification. It is actually the buyer that incurs the costs. So in terms of methodology cost, Isometric has a quite interesting model where you as the project developer are not liable to pay anything for the certification process. This cost is put on the buyers. The types of credits that can be generated under Isometric are of a 200-year permanence, and they also have 1,000+ year durability. So it was one of the first markets to really go and allow for 500-year crediting options to be available. There are currently 2 projects under validation, and something that's interesting to highlight is that Frontier, which is a very large purchaser of biochar credits, has stated that they would only be purchasing carbon credits that are coming from Isometric's protocol. So this just gives some perspective as to how certain companies are seeing and positioning themselves with regards to Isometric. In terms of eligibility, of course, similar to other protocols, you need to ensure that the feedstock is sustainable, that there are no market leakages, and that full traceability throughout the entire project from the biomass sourcing all the way to the biochar application are tracked. On Isometric's website, there is quite high transparency. Each credit has a public LCA from cradle to grave that is accessible to the public, and this includes a permanent audit trail. It's important, and Isometric puts a lot of focus on discounting for losses. So it has one of the most stringent LCAs and emission modeling, as well as greenhouse gas emission modeling and tracking systems. And so it ensures, similar to the other methodologies, that only net removals are credited. This means that when you're conducting your LCA, you will subtract all of the emissions from the biochar production process, feedstock acquisition, transport, packaging, etc., from the gross emissions, and you're only left with net emissions. Isometric has really stringent calculations with regards to this. And so their durability and quantification is based on scientific modeling. So as I mentioned, there's 200 years crediting period. This is determined via temporal decay, so the hydrogen over carbon ratio in conjunction with soil temperature. And if you would like to certify your carbon removal on a 1,000+ year basis, then this is supported. However, you have to go through extra testing through random reflectings. And here it's anything that's showing above 2% inertia night is showing high permanence. And similar to the other methodologies that I've presented so far, Isometric allows for both soil and non-soil applications. Some of the key considerations for Isometric are that in terms of its credit issuance, they take place on an ongoing issuance basis. So monthly verifications for suppliers is possible. Isometric does not do any pre-issuance of credits. Everything is ex post. And if your credits are not able to show a minimum of 200-year durability, then they will not be generated. So again, minimum 200-year durability. And in terms of certification, they are also highly efficient. You can see here the timeline below. Contracting, first contracts take between 1 to 2 weeks. Onboarding also happens in that amount of time. Project submission can take place between 2 to 4 weeks, and validation and verification of all of those documents takes about 2 to 4 months. After that, it's a week later that credits can be generated. So Isometric is another of the carbon removal methodologies that has a very high efficiency in terms of its certification timeline. Now we'll quickly move over to Riverse. So Riverse was launched in December of 2024. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Riverse has previously been very European-centric. However, now yesterday, actually, they announced that they certified their first project on the African continent, showing that they're expanding this focus and not only focusing on European project developers. Currently, there are 6 biochar projects that have gone through the Riverse protocol, and there are 2 that are currently in consultation. Important to distinguish here is that Riverse is focused on agricultural applications of the biochar only. Their core criteria are 100-year durability is required, meaning that your LCA must also include a 100-year sequestration. Here, Riverse uses less than 0.7 as the hydrogen over carbon ratio for its permanence determinant, versus the other methodologies that I've presented that are using the less than 0.4. And this allows them also to work on higher durability, and that's why some are now working on the 200-year durability basis. Riverse does have the criteria that your project over the first 5 years of its existence must show 1,000 tons or more of CO2 that has been sequestered, or that has been permanently sequestered. So in that sense, it can be thought about as a minimum project size. Riverse has a strong focus also on co-benefits. So there's a minimum of 2 UN SDG aligned benefits that are required, and that must be monitored and well documented to be able to go through its certification. And of course, carbon must remain stable in the soil to earn credits. As I mentioned earlier, Riverse does not work with sea sinks in other non-soil applications such as construction materials. Riverse sets out an eligibility criteria of 14 points. Similar to the other methodologies, this is focused on proving and documenting negative emissions, permanence of the biochar, and showing that the projects are additional. Additionality focuses on financial additionality and also regulatory additionality. So these are key points throughout all of the different biochar removal certifications, is that projects must show proof of additionality. The minimum size, as I mentioned, is 1,000 tons of CO2 over a 5-year period. 2 SDGs co-benefits must be shown, and the projects must prove that they have no environmental or social harm. In Riverse, the methodology and the LCA focuses on cradle to grave, and here they work with third-party audits for the LCA, for the project design documentation, as well as the monitoring plan. And Riverse issues credits post-verification. So again, no pre-issuance of credits. And they have flexible auditing, which can be on a rolling issuing basis. So similar to the other methodologies, you're able to work to get your credits issued on a rolling and continuous basis, rather than having strict thresholds on once a year or once a quarter. Some key considerations are that the crediting period, so the minimum project duration for Riverse are 5 years. This can of course be extended. In terms of credit issuance, as I mentioned, these happen on a rolling basis as verifications are approved. There is no pre-issuance, and the certification timeline that you can see here is quite longer than previous methodologies. Here it is estimated that going through the entire Riverse protocol and issuing your first credits can take upwards of a year's time, sometimes between 1 to 2 years. Next, we will go on to Climate Action Reserve. So briefly, Climate Action Reserve was launched in their biochar protocol specifically, was launched in March of 2024. As I mentioned at the very beginning, Climate Action Reserve places a strong focus on the US and Canada. So if your project is not located in one of these 2 countries, then you're not able to be using the Climate Action Reserve protocol. Currently, there are 9 active projects. Some of the key requirements here are 100-year durability that must be reflected in the LCA. This is reflected by the use of a hydrogen over carbon ratio of less than 0.7, which is the assessment that is used for the permanence of biochar. The scope of the LCA is from cradle to grave, and Climate Action Reserve accepts uses and applications of biochar in both soil and non-soil applications. In terms of its biochar protocol, Climate Action Reserve works on an annual reporting basis. So this means that every 12 months, there must be an annual report that's submitted. However, this can also be done on a sub-annual option, meaning that reports can be sent out on a monthly, quarterly, or a semi-annual basis, allowing for more flexibility in terms of credit generation. The Climate Action Reserve tons are issued only after the reserve has approved a verification and successful auditing. And certification has to happen at least on a biannual basis. And they provide flexibility in that one verification period can cover multiple reporting periods. This means that you can be producing carbon removal sort of certificates, you can be producing biochar and having this last over multiple periods where you're reporting the production of biochar, and you can have one verification that covers multiple past reporting periods. So this also allows for more flexibility, especially for smaller projects, that you can have one verification period that is going to cover and issue credits for past productions over multiple reporting periods. The permanence of the Climate Action Reserve biochar, as I mentioned, has been on a 100-year persistence, and this is proven by the H/C ratio of less than 0.7. In terms of credit issuance, it is expected Climate Action Reserve to see its first credits issued by a project developer 12 months or more after the launch, seeing as this requires full reporting period, on-site verification, and just typically the monitoring times are longer for Climate Action Reserve. So here you can see a similar timeline to Riverse, that it can take upwards of 12 months before certification is achieved. Finally, the last methodology that we're going to quickly go over is Verified Carbon Standards, or VCS. This was launched in 2021, and VCS has a global scope. The applications that are allowed for biochar are on soil and non-soil applications. The life cycle approach, the LCA that is conducted by VCS, the requirements are from a cradle to grave. And here, the durability requirements are of an H/C ratio of less than 0.4, and Verra is still operating on a 100-year permanence. Something that's interesting about the VCS methodology is that in addition to Carbon Standards International, it is the only methodology that allows also for low-tech systems to be used and implemented. So this means that if you are focusing on having a decentralized biochar project with smallholder farmers, you would be able to certify your project under Verra. As I mentioned, though, in this webinar, we're focused on the industrial certifications. So the next couple of slides are going to be focused on the industrial standard. So the greenhouse gas emission project boundaries, as I mentioned, focus on cradle to grave. Here under Verra, the feedstock production is not needed to be accounting in the greenhouse gas emission boundaries. So this means that emissions from the growing of the feedstock are not required. However, everything that is the acquisition of the feedstock, the transportation to the site, must be included in the boundaries. The decay and permanence factors are based on EBC guidance, therefore working with an H/C ratio of less than 0.7. For the high-tech systems, the permanence and the decay factors that need to be considered are focused on the temperature that is being used. Lower temperatures show decays of 0.65. This means essentially that the difference needs to be removed, so you would need to remove around 35% of the carbon content. And in higher temperatures, so operating above 600 degrees, this would be 11% of the carbon that you need to remove from your total carbon sink as potential for decay in the natural environment. And this is much higher in the lower tech system. So there you would see a permanence decay factor of 0.56. meaning that essentially 44% of that carbon would need to be removed to account for potential decay in the natural environment. If you are using non-soil applications for your biochar, the default decay factors will go back to that of the soils. And so under the Verra standard, also VCUs, which are the name for their carbon removal units, never expire. This is to avoid any sort of double accounting and to ensure that that tracking can be continuous over time. This is similar to the other methodologies that also have a very long backlog of carbon removal credits. So you can go into the registries and you're able to have documentation trails of past carbon removals. In terms of the crediting period, once you have finished your first reporting period is typically when you can begin issuing your first credits. Verra it's on the longer end of the credit issuance, typically 12 to 18 months or more from the start of the project is when you would be able to start generating credits. Credit issuance, similar to the other methodologies, occurs once you have fulfilled the full site verification and site audit and the project has been validated. And no credits can be issued until both the validation and the verification are complete. And so here, as I mentioned, timeline can range anywhere from 12 to 18 months from the project start in terms of issuing carbon removal credits. This is a slide that is comparing costs. So in the slide, we actually worked with the Carbon Pilot tool. Carbon Pilot is an MRV platform, and they also have a lot of different tools on their website through which you can assess the feasibilities of your project. And here we present a cost comparison by registry. It is important to note that the assumption that we made here was issuing 1,000 tons of CO2 per the different methodologies. So here you can see the different registries on the left and the different types of fees that are included for achieving certification of your biochar carbon removal credits. So here you're able to see which standards incur setup fees, what the annual fees are for the different ones, what the issuance fees are per credits, and what the total cost would be. So again, this was modeled with the Carbon Pilot tool on a 1,000 tons of CO2. So essentially, this is what it could look like if you're issuing 1,000 tons of CO2. And it's also important to mention that these costs here are only showing costs that would be incurred directly through the use of the platform. If you're working with third parties, for example, for all of the LCA validation for the PDD writing, the writing of your project design document, then these would of course include additional fees. So I'll just leave this here. Here it's interesting because on the full right-hand side, you would be able to see the cost per credit under the different methodologies. And once again, you may notice that Isometric is not presented here. And that is because all of the fees that are listed here for the other platforms under Isometric, those costs, would be covered directly by the buyers. And so Isometric does not have costs that are incurred by the project developer. Again, unless there is extra help that is required from third-party consultants for the conduction of the LCA, for example, or the PDD writing, then these can, of course, result in costs. But here we present the costs that are directly related to the different methodologies. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but as the webinar is recorded, we are also going to be sending out the slides, so you will be able to have access and refer back to all of these tables. Here, we also modeled carbon credit generation. So we did not focus on conducting an LCA, of course, as this is very project specific, but this essentially just goes to show what the default permanence factors are of the different methodologies. Here we ran a scenario assuming that woody biomass was being used to produce biochar with a 77% carbon content and a hydrogen over carbon ratio of 0.4. Here, this simulation is using just the default permanence factors of the different standards, and we simulated what it would look like if 1,000 tons of biochar were being produced. This is helpful essentially in just seeing how, without the inclusion of an LCA, working with a different methodology and their respective default factors can have an impact on your credit issuance. As I mentioned, it's very important to keep in mind that this does not then include the subtraction of all of the emissions that would be accounted for in the LCA system. So these are far from being the final numbers, but they do provide an overview of the default permanence factors per methodology and how it would look if you were to be producing 1,000 tons of biochar with each of the different standards without the inclusion of an LCA. So as I mentioned, you will have access to the slides and also to the resources. This slide here was also conducted using Carbon Pilot's tool. So yeah, really would recommend checking out that tool if you're a project developer. It is quite useful. And finally, we go into the methodology fit by project profile. So the focus of this webinar was not on the small and artisanal scaled biochar productions. However, if that is something that you're interested in, then the two registries that would be the best fit are the Global Artisan Seasync as well as Verra, as they allow for low tech projects to be registered. Projects that are working at industrial global scales can go through Puro, Isometric, Verra, Riverse as well, and as well as Climate Action Reserve. However, these have geographic focuses or have had in the past. Therefore, if you're looking for industrial scale in Europe, Carbon Standards International with its EBC certification and Riverse that has a strong focus on Europe are good registries to look at. However, it is important to note that all of the registries that I presented, except for Climate Action Reserve, could also be used in the European context. If you're operating in North America, Climate Action Reserve is a strong methodology. Here, the geographic focus, what's interesting about Climate Action Reserve is that they are taking into consideration the emission guidelines of the United States and Canada. So in this way, when there are potential buyers that are looking into biochar carbon credits, what the emissions from these biochar production processes may be, you tend to speak the same language as all of the emission thresholds are related to regulation in North America. Highly durability demand. So here we state Isometric just because of their focus also on random reflectance testing for their 500 to 1,000 year credit types. Puro.earth is also doing the same. So if you're looking for high durability demand, Isometric, keeping in mind that they are more rigorous and also more strict in terms of their LCA calculations, but they do this in order to also have increased durability. So it could be an interesting one to look into. And if your priority in your project is to have fast carbon credit issuance, Isometric, CSI, and Climate Action Reserve, we were some of the most efficient in terms of getting you through all of the documentation, validation, audits, and being able to have flexibility in the issuance of your carbon removal credits. So I'll leave this table here. Again, you will have access to all of this information. Just before wrapping up and moving to the Q&A, so just very briefly on BioFlux, we help different companies go through their certification requirements. So if you're looking for strategic support, technical expertise, or just support in the certification and crediting of your project, then feel free to get into contact with us because we are happy to help you go through, find which carbon methodology would be the most suitable for you, as well as support you through that process. And finally, as I mentioned here, we have a QR code. I leave this on the screen as I'm conscious of the time in the Q&A. If we're not able to go through all of the questions, please feel free to submit the Google form that this QR code links to and send through any of your questions, and we'll have a member of our team that will get back to you very shortly. So I will now transition over to the Q&A. You have the Q&A chat function. Therefore, I will go through the questions that have been submitted there. And I will reshare the screen at the very end for those that were not able to join and sign or open up the QR code. So I'm now going to go through the different Q&A. Please feel free to add these into the presentation. One of the first questions, how can we contact for support? I will leave the slide up, and there you're able to see our email and details. I will leave this here. There's a question by Rocio that asks, could you clarify what you mean with high durability demand in relation to the type of project and the best fit of the registry? So Rocio, here what I mean is that the different carbon removal methodologies, as I presented, focus on different permanence of the biochar. So there are some methodologies that are focused on 100-year permanence. There are others that focus on 200-year permanence. And so what this means is that they're essentially verifying that the biochar that you are integrating into the soil and that the carbon sink that you are creating will be remaining and persistent in the environment and will be durable for 100 to 200-year periods. Now there's Carbon Standards International, Puro.earth, and Isometric that work with random reflectance testing to be able to certify 1,000 plus year durability. And so this means that if a buyer, from a buyer point of view, were to be purchasing a carbon removal credit from Isometric, for example, they would be able to see in the registry that this carbon sink that has been created has a permanence in the soil of over 1,000 plus years. And so from a buyer point of view, they are assured that the carbon credit that they're purchasing from is of high durability, as we call it. So I hope that that answers your question. Laura asks if the Puro methodology accepts artisanal projects. So this I have answered, and unfortunately not. So if you're looking at artisanal biochar projects, then your best bets are to be looking into the Global Artisan Sea-Sink methodology by Carbon Standards International, as well as Verra, that allows for low-tech biochar projects to be implemented. There's another question on how much biochar I should produce to be at an industrial scale. So this is it's a good question. There are some methodologies, as I mentioned, Riverse, for example, where you need to be showing a minimum of 1,000 tons of CO2 that have been sequestered over a 5-year period. However, there is not a determined minimum size. What is really important to consider when developing your project is conducting a cost-benefit analysis where you really look into the cost of the technologies that you're associated with, how much biochar you will be producing, and the revenues that you would be potentially generating from this process. So again, the methodologies don't explicitly state a minimum quantity of biochar that must be produced to be under industrial scale. However, this really comes from a minimum of having a cost benefit analysis. Your cost benefit analysis really has to make sense. Another question is it possible to obtain pre-approval from our proposed biomass feedstock as part of feasibility assessment for biochar projects? So if I answer the question correctly, or sorry, if I understand the question correctly, you're asking if you can get pre-approval of your biomass before going through and developing a project with a certain methodology, and this is possible. You can do this by either getting in contact directly with the different standard holders or accessing the positive feedstock lists that they have. So each of the different methodologies has a list of approved biomass feedstocks that you would be able to essentially compare what your project feedstock is. These are also questions that we're happy to provide any specific guidance on. Another question is, if I'm a small biochar producer using an artisan-approved pyrolysis machine, producing 100 tons per year, would be able to work with Isometric? So no, because if you're using an artisanal approved pyrolysis machine, I assume that you're referring to flame curtain pyrolysis in either the form of a 𝐑𝐞𝐚𝐥 kiln or potentially a TLUD, and this would not be allowed. So each of the different methodologies also has a technology section where they disclose what type of technologies are suitable for their projects, which ones are able to be certified, and a lot of these focus on having closed loop systems where all excess gas and syngas is being recirculated within the system in one way or another, either burned directly, used as power for drying processes. But you need to have a minimum of excess heat that is revalorized or reused within your system. And unfortunately, this is not the case for artisanal projects. So you would not be able to work with Isometric. Another question is, what is the average price on the voluntary carbon market from different buyers? So here I would like to guide you towards a very interesting tool, open sourced, that is called CDR.FYI. And there you can actually extract a lot of real-time information on how carbon credit prices are shifting on the market. Typically, we see carbon credit prices, ranging from 130 to 180. There have been cases where this goes higher. There have been cases where offtake agreements have happened on a lower basis. There are also interesting discussions that are being had on how the pricing mechanisms can differ based on the durability of the actual carbon sink. This would mean, for example, that if you're using a methodology and your biochar is registered over a 1,000-year time horizon, that the value of your carbon credit could have a premium as compared to if you're registering a credit that has just a 100-year durability. Another question saying that isometric, will it be zero in total? This is referring to the cost of the project. And so, yes, for isometric, as a project developer, you will incur no direct costs coming from isometric in order to get your project certified. So if there are any costs that come, it comes from requesting help from third parties, either to verify your information, to help conduct the LCA. However, all of the verification and the audits are essentially paid for by the buyers. And so this is, Isometric is one of the only ones that has such a model where the costs for certification are not put on the project developer, but are rather put on the buyer, as the buyer pays for the premium of having, of using a very durable methodology. Just scrolling through more questions. So here we have another follow-up. Yeah, Bishop, really interesting here. What I would offer is that you contact us directly through our email, and we can look at together the specificities of your kiln, and we can assess how it would be able to be used in the specific cases under the different methodologies. So there's another question on the validation and verification costs. So these are also determined by the different methodologies, of course. Methodologies typically have a public website. So on their website, you can publicly access what the different verification costs would be. What we try to do in the cost slide that I will reshare now is essentially provide a view of what the different stages of the, excuse me, I'm not able to switch slides. So here you would be able to see these are the specific fees for the different registries, of course, in terms of validation costs and auditing costs. So these are really dependent on the size of the project, the location of the project. typically auditors are going to need to be sent by the certification body to your project site. Dependent on the size of the project, depending on the location of the project, there's going to be different costs for validation. Many of these are publicly stated on the websites of the verification bodies of the different standard holders. So yeah, we've seen verification costs ranging really from 5,000 to 10,000 euros upwards. I don't want to give you a very specific range without knowing more on the size of the project. But again, feel free to either check out the different registries. They all typically have costs that have been publicly communicated on their website. And if you have specific information on your project size, then we're happy to look at that together and go over a potential cost comparison. So now another question from Mia that asks about the financial advantages of biochar projects compared with other CDR projects that are registered on the VCM platforms. So really interesting question. I think something that's really key to biochar is looking at it as essentially a holistic project. So when you're working and you're producing biochar, you're not only producing a solid product that eventually through these certifications will be linked to an amount of CO2 that is being sequestered, but you're also producing a product that is able to be used as a soil amendment that has a lot of environmental co-benefits. So biochar is extremely interesting for everything that is soil regeneration, water holding capacity increases, regulating the pH in the different soils, and of course, increasing agricultural yields. And so when you're purchasing a ton of biochar carbon removal, you're not only purchasing the ton of carbon removal itself, but you're also facilitating the financial benefits of all of the different co-benefits that come together with biochar through the biochar production process as well. So I'm answering this also from the point of view of a project developer, Mia. As a project developer, if you have an installation on site, depending on where you are in the system that you're able to use, you're able to commercialize 3 different revenue streams. So you would be able to have the revenue stream coming from the biochar as a physical product itself. You would also be able to have the energy benefit. So excess thermal energy from the pyrolysis process can be converted into steam, cooling, electricity, or hot water, which can either be sold or used internally by companies and project developers. So there you also diversify your revenue streams. And then finally, you have the revenue streams coming from the carbon removal credits. So biochar is really one of the CDRs on the market that goes beyond just carbon removal and also has a wide range of environmental co-benefits. And I think it's really important to look at those environmental co-benefits when you're assessing the price of biochar carbon removal. Some people ask, why is the price so high? Other people are asking, why is it so low? For those that ask why it's so high, it's also important to look at the holistic picture and the impacts beyond just biochar carbon removal. I think we have time for just one more question before wrapping it up. The question is, does biochar have a price point per ton depending on its use case for agri or construction? Is there a robust growing market for these sales, or is the feasibility of projects solely contingent on corks? So again, very interesting question. It's very dependent on the geography at which you find yourself. There are projects that produce biochar where the biochar is given for free, and the model of the company, the financial business case of the company, fully focuses on the sale of carbon removal credits. You have other biochar carbon removal projects in Europe, in North America, for example, where the revenue split coming from energy, biochar, and carbon credits all play a very important factor. And there are typical prices per sector. Again, these range in geography. And so at the very beginning of biochar carbon removal, everybody was hearing about these 1,000 plus euros per ton that they would be able to sell for. These are not the prices that we're seeing now on the market. They depend very much depending on the industry that you're selling to. whether you're selling into agriculture, if you're selling into specific applications such as filtrations, there you can really see the price premium increases. So feel free to reach out as well, and we would be happy to discuss more about sectors of interest for your potential markets and what you could be expecting as potential prices. So with that, I would like to give you all a very, very warm thank you for joining us today on our very first edition of the webinar on navigating biochar carbon removals. We are going to be releasing more webinars focused on topics such as insetting, integrating carbon removal, biochar carbon removal into corporate strategies. So stay tuned to our pages as we will be continuing our series. And once again, would like to thank you all. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. And thank you very much for your attendance today. Very much appreciated. Thank you.